Off again now.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. You've probably heard this 15 times now if you've been around for a second, but my name is Gillian Askew and I'm your host for today. I'm one of the directors of Go for Growth, who's commissioned by Bradford Council to support small and voluntary sector providers to work for the public sector, including Bradford Council as a commissioning organisation. As you know, I'm joined by Tahira, lots of Tahiras today, but one actual Tahira, the Commissioning Manager for Early Help and Prevention. I'll hand over to Tahira in a second just to say a few words, but I'll just clear up the housekeeping first off, if that's okay. So the session, as you've heard, is being recorded today. We will send a copy of the recording out. It will also be available on the Go for Growth YouTube channel in our Bid Skills playlist. And we'll also send a copy of the slide deck, all with the live links that we're talking through today. So please don't feel under any pressure to take a load of notes if you don't want to today. Everything that you see and hear will come out to you afterwards. And it will come out to all registered attendees. So if you register, I know you won't hear this if you're not actually here, but it will be on demand. So if you register later or you couldn't make it today, everything that we go through will be available to you. You won't miss anything. So Tahira, yes, if you would like to introduce yourself and say a few words before we kick off, that would be grand.
That's fine. Thanks, Gillian. So I'm Tahira Parveen. I'm a commissioning manager at the Bradford Council, and my area is early help and prevention for adults. So some of you here might have attended a market engagement session I ran a few weeks ago. And at that session, I'd asked if people would feel it beneficial to have a bit of a tender ready training session, and most of you welcomed that opportunity. So we've set this up alongside with Gillian and her colleague Lauren to deliver this for you today. And just to say, that session that we ran was for a young people service. But even if you're not interested in that service, this session is still open to everybody. So the tender ready training session is a general session that we basically have advertised it so anybody's okay to attend this. If there's any questions that I can answer, I will try my best, but I'll leave this for Gillian because she is the expert in this area. So I'll pass it back over to Gillian. Thank you.
Thank you, Tahira. So we have got time set aside for questions at the end. However, if you've got questions as we go, please do feel free to ask them. If you want to pop them in the Q&A, that would be helpful, or if you put them in the chat function. I will try and keep an eye on both, and I'll try and answer stuff as they come up, or we'll carve some time out at the end. If for any reason we run out of time, and I know time is often, we will definitely finish on time, so we won't keep anybody behind. So if we do run out of time and can't answer any questions, we'll answer those questions after the event and send the answers out with the slide deck. So if for any reason we don't get through everything, we'll do it that way. But to kick off, you might know some of the information that I'm going to go through today. So forgive me if I tell you things that you already know, but you might not know some of this stuff as well. A little bit of background on me. I'm a public procurement professional. I've been in procurement, both private sector and public sector, for nearly 30 years. I'm also a micro business owner. I run a social enterprise working for the public sector. So I've walked a mile in both pairs of shoes. I know what it's like to bid for public sector opportunities, and I've been the contracting authority setting those public sector bids. So I understand it from both lenses, which hopefully comes through on what I'm talking about today, but also is quite helpful. So there's 8 key steps, I guess, involved in the public procurement process. You can find opportunities a number of ways. So opportunities will be advertised, not just when they're live, but often future opportunities, pipeline opportunities. And it is now part of the regulatory environment that every contracting authority has a pipeline and they publish it. However, the level at which they have to publish is still really quite high. So for smaller level opportunities, you should be able to find future opportunities, but you might not always be able to see them until they're published. But notwithstanding that, you can find opportunities live and future on something called EU Supply, which you might be familiar with if you're already working in the Yorkshire local authority area, including for Bradford, or on Contracts Finder and Finder Tender Service. So Contracts Finder is for opportunities above 25,000 in value for the wider public sector. It's slightly lower if it's government, central government, which is £10,000. It's good practice guidance for the public sector to advertise anything on Contracts Finder over 25,000. The Finder Tender Service, which is often abbreviated to FTS, that's for opportunities above 118,000, which should also be seen on Contracts Finder. So Contracts Finder is often a good portal search engine to use. And what Contracts Finder will do when you found an opportunity that's relevant to you, it'll tell you which bidding portal you'll need to work in. So if it was Bradford, that would be EU Supply Your Tender. For Bradford Council, when they publish an opportunity, it will be published on EU Supply. That will be where you would bid it. And those values that you see on any of these search engines, including EU Supply as the bid portal, they are a maximum value for the total life of the contract. They're not necessarily a guarantee of what you can achieve through the contract. And it's worth noting that some bids will specify a maximum cost that you can submit, and anything that you submit above that could actually count you out. It could disqualify you. So I recently have done a bid myself where the published total contract value was 170,000, but how you priced it was on a day rate, and the maximum day rate that you could put in your bid was £400 per day, and anybody that bid above £400 a day would be automatically disqualified. So the contract values doesn't necessarily correlate to what you would be bidding your price at and what the winning price would be. Bear in mind as well that on advertisement, values must be inclusive of VAT. So you're working back from that VAT point. So if it's advertised at 170,000, you would be taking 20% of VAT off that. So every process will have a clarification period, and that clarification period is where you get to ask questions through the portal. In Bradford's case, that would be EU Supply, and that's to clarify points of information that should be helpful for you to bid. Our advice is always use clarifications as early as you possibly can. It is behavioural. I think it's normal to be a bit last minute Larry with stuff like that. It's a bit like when you're applying for a job. We'll do our application the day before we have to submit it. However, the clarification period doesn't last the entire time that the opportunity is live. It's usually only open for a couple of weeks at the front end. And if you don't read the documents until too late, then you'll miss the opportunity to ask any questions. There'll always be a clarification log that's published with answers to clarification questions. The authority that's advertising have to do that. So often it can be easier to check if the question you have has been asked first, and then you might have an answer and not need to ask it again and wait for that answer coming out. You'll then obviously submit your bid, which will be evaluated. We're going to talk about evaluation and what's included in a little bit of time. But once a bid submission has been scored, there is an intent to award. So the contracting authority will intend to award to somebody, and they'll notify winners and losers of that. And once winners and losers have been notified of what the intent to award is, a standstill period would then kick in. And the standstill period must be 10 clear calendar days. The public sector can't award on a weekend or a bank holiday. So winners and losers have to be notified. You should get your feedback about why you didn't win if you were unsuccessful. And then you have 10 clear days. And in that 10 clear day standstill period, you have the right to challenge the decision. And you would do that in writing through the portal. And that's what the standstill is there for. Once standstill is being observed, if there's no challenges, then that will go to formal contract award. Standstill has to be observed when it's above threshold. So in the public sector, the regulatory, the legal environment kicks in at a certain value. So for supplies and services, which is where this opportunity that Tyra was talking about would sit, the threshold for the regulations kicks in at £213,477, inclusive of VAT. So it's around 177,000 excluding VAT. For works in construction, for example, that's 5,336,937. And there is something called the light touch regime, which covers things like social care, where there is a more flexible set of regulations. The advertising limit, the threshold for that is £663,540. So that's where you would have to observe things like the standstill period, and the process becomes much more regulated at that point. I'm just going to quickly check the chat. So, and I think we've got a question. So a question re the VAT. We recently applied for a government tender when we asked if the budget allocated included VAT. We were told by the authority that the budget allocation is excluding VAT. I don't know what the overarching value was, but the guidance that came out through the Cabinet Office in 2021 that kicked in 2022 made it law that you must include VAT in your advertising. Now that would be regulated at 213,000 for supplies and services. So maybe it was below and there is a bit more flexibility, but you should expect that to be inclusive of VAT at any level. That's what the guidance is from Cabinet Office. But if you want to share some more details with me, my email's at the end, and we can have a chat about that if you would like to. So let me move on. So I'm presuming that some of you will be familiar with both Your Tender and Contracts Finder, but some may not. So for those that want it, when you get the slide deck, if you click on the Your Procure EU Supply picture or the gov.uk logo, what I've done is embedded some tutorial videos in there for you. They're quite short, but if you've not used those portals before, there is what I hope is a hopeful tutorial video to help you navigate both of those portals. And you can see to the left of the screen that there's a URL that will take you to those portals as well. Contracts Finder, I've mentioned it already. It is just a search engine. You don't bid anything through Contracts Finder or find a tender service. They'll tell you about the opportunity and then they'll point you somewhere else. Contracts Finder, as I've said, kicks in at 25,000 or 10,000 for central government, but EU Supply, the Your Tender portal, is where you'll find opportunities and bid for them for Bradford Council and indeed all local authorities across Yorkshire. So hopefully there's some useful information in there. So I've broken down the contracts process into 6 key elements that you can see on screen. In any procurement, there's a set of bidder instructions. Sometimes they'll be embedded in the invitation to tender. That's where they will tell you about the process, what's happening, what they're doing. Sometimes the specification will be embedded in the invitation to tender. Sometimes the instructions will be a separate document. I would say don't be overwhelmed by the instructions to bidders, but don't ignore them either. They can be a weighty document, but they are there to help you navigate the process. So they'll have things in them like the key dates of when the opportunity opened, when it closes, when clarifications can be asked, when you'll get answers back to the clarifications. There could be a checklist in there in terms of what documents you need to upload with your submission, etc., etc. So it's a useful document to start with, is the instructions for bidders. If you have any questions on it, you can always give us a shout and we'll help you navigate your way through it. At the front end of any public procurement process, there will be something called the Standard Selection Questionnaire, and we love an acronym in the public sector, so all of these things are abbreviated. So the Standard Selection Questionnaire is SSQ, and that's what you'll hear people talking about. There are 8 sections in the Standard Selection Questionnaire, but depending on how big in terms of value or complex the procurement is, and also depending a little bit on what sector the procurement's in, you might not have to answer all 8 sections. And it will cover things like who you are, what kind of business you are. It will look at your financial and economic standing, what your experience has been. It'll look at your accreditations, licenses, policies, or insurances, all of that kind of stuff. And we often find providers struggle with some of the stuff that's in the Standard Selection Questionnaire, and it is at the front end of everything. So just as a note to say, we've developed it's a free of charge public sector supply ready accreditation for providers, and it takes you through the Standard Selection Questionnaire. And often we find it's much easier to do that when the clock isn't ticking on a competition, so you can work out what you've got versus what you need. And it can actually act as a template for you for future competitions. It's wrapped around with all help and support from Go for Growth. It's free of charge, like I say. There's a URL on one of the last slides for it. So if you want to have a look in there, it will help you navigate a lot of that Standard Selection Questionnaire. Everything that's general to a procurement is in there. You'll have in any procurement or specification, it's a description, as you would imagine, of what the contracting authority wants to buy. And it's one of the most important documents, and we'll talk about the specification in a bit more detail shortly. There'll also be an evaluation criteria, and that evaluation criteria is basically a description of how your responses as bidders will be scored. And it will also tell you how much each question is worth via a weighting. And again, we'll talk through that in a little bit more detail shortly. You'll have quality, technical and pricing related questions. We're going to go through a live example actually of a technical and quality question shortly in more detail, but you'll have those in the bid. I think someone's just come off mute. If you could go back on mute for me, that would be grand. And there will be legal terms and conditions obviously at play for any tender. Our advice on legal terms and conditions, let me mute everyone. I've just muted everyone, sorry, just to clear that background noise. So there'll be legal terms and conditions. Our advice is read them carefully, ask any questions that you might have on the legals to the contracting authority through that clarification process that I've talked about. If you're a member of local chambers or the Federation of Small Businesses, you will have access to free legal support as part of that membership. So ask any questions that you've got there. And we're not lawyers in Go for Growth, but you can, if you've got a question on legal terms and conditions, you can give us a shout also. We'll try and get that advice for you. And then finally, the sixth part of the process is feedback. All bidders will be notified whether they're successful or not. If you're not successful, what you should get in feedback is your score versus the winning bidder's score, and hopefully you should get some detailed feedback and an explanation of those scores. And the new regulations, now that we are not a part of the Economic European Union, we've got new regulations for public procurement coming into force late 2024, and there are changes to the feedback process to make it better for providers in terms of what you are supposed to get. And you'll see on the screen that number 2, 3, 5 and 6 are in blue and underlined. That's because there's a live link to those sections. We did a series of lunch and learn sessions back in March on those specific sections. So I've included a link to the video of those sessions. So we go through in the legal terms and conditions some of the key elements of the legalities of it and what to expect, what to think about. Hopefully it's helpful if you do need a bit more detailed support on those areas as we go through. We'll dive into a bit more detail. The specification. So I mean, it sounds very obvious, but it is basically what the contracting authority wants to buy, but it is one of the most important documents in any bid process. It's really crucial. Our advice is make it one of the first jobs that you do to read the specification. On a very personal note, when I'm bidding, what I tend to do, and it certainly works well for us, is to read the specification. I tick off the bits that I know we can do. I make note of any evidences that we might be able to provide as part of our bid submission of being able to deliver that part of the specification. And I also make a note of any questions that I have as a result of the spec. And I make a note of any gaps that we've got as an organisation. And assessing those gaps is really quite important in terms of that bid or no bid decision. If you can't deliver a good chunk of the specification, you might decide that actually you are too far away to be able to bid that opportunity at this point. If there's small enough gaps or you've got no gaps, then you might choose to continue. But it can be a good way at the beginning of a process to help you qualify whether you should continue with the process or not. When you complete the quality and technical questions, and we'll talk through this again in a minute, your answers to those questions should relate back to this specification. What the quality questions are doing are testing your ability to deliver what's needed in that specification. So referencing part of the specification that relates into your question answers can really help to enhance your scores. And it's worth noting that in public procurement, you should only be tested in those quality and technical questions in the evaluation criteria, something that is within the specification. There shouldn't be a question in those quality questions that doesn't relate to the specification. Okay, so you should be able to relate those quality questions back to the spec. So that spec is a really, really crucial document. And there are two types of criteria in procurement. So we've talked about selection, the standard selection questionnaire, and there's evaluation criteria. So you've got selection criteria and evaluation criteria. Selection criteria at the front end is generally a look backwards at your business as a whole, testing what the business has at its disposal and testing those experiences, your financial standing, testing if your insurances, accreditations, your policies are where an organisation is needed to be to work for that contracting authority. It will test things like things that are grounds for exclusion in that selection questionnaire. Evaluation criteria, however, is framed more as a look forward about how you will deliver the specification that's in the tender documents. So therefore, the questions that you're being asked should be framed as a look forward around how you will do something. And if you can answer that question with a backup with evidence of what you already have done somewhere or what you will do, linking back to the specification, that can really maximise your score. And in every competitive process, regardless of value, it should have in it how the award is going to be made. And usually it's on a sliding scale. So if you've seen these before, you might see 0 to 100 or 1 to 5. There's usually 5 different scores. And there should be details of what that score means. So if you're scoring 0, it might say failure to answer the question in its entirety, failure to give any relevant evidences, etc., etc. Whereas 5 at the top is couldn't have answered this better if they'd have tried. We had excellent examples of evidence and all parts of the question were answered. So have a look at how the evaluation criteria is set up. And they'll have with them a weighting per question. And if there's 100% of scores available, that each question will be given a proportion of that score. So the higher the weighting, the more important the question is, and therefore the more important your answer is, and the more ability a good answer will have to help you win a bid. So we've seen in bids before where you might have 3 questions, for example, all with a similar word count, so 500 words each, but all with different weightings. So question 1 might have a 50% weighting, question 2 a 30% weighting, question 3 a 20% weighting. What you can see very clearly is that question 1 is the most important, so that's where you would be focusing most of your effort and really providing your best evidences. And it might be that there is a minimum score that you need to achieve across those quality questions in order to be able to be accepted into the next stages. So I've got an example, a live example on the next slide to work through, but some of this, and forgive me, I know it's going to sound really obvious, but I've been in procurement for all of my career and I've been bidding for 10 years. And these are things that it's so easy to fall foul of that I often find it's worth pulling out. What we're going to look at on the next slide is how to break down a quality question. We're going to look at the verb elements, the doing elements of it. But some tips, if I may, and it sounds really obvious, only answer the question that you've been asked. As a provider, I know when I'm bidding, I think we've got a really great offer. I want to tell you all about it. Sometimes I don't know that the question, or I don't think that the question has been scripted in the way that I might like it to have, or it hasn't asked me about my social value contribution, for example, and so I want to shoehorn it in. Just don't, because you're using word count that won't get you extra scores. Make sure that you only answer the question that's been asked, regardless of how good or bad that question is, and evidence your answers as much as you possibly can. An evaluator will always go to the so what. So if you are saying, for example, we are really great at customer service, and you might be really great at customer service, but if you don't say how, if you don't evidence that in some way, the evaluator won't be able to score that as well as they could if they had some backup for that. I know that sounds obvious, but it's one thing to keep in our minds. And don't forget to upload any documents, either that the contracting authority has asked for, or that you have said you're submitting as part of your evidentiary process, as part of your bid. And there are usually some kind of constraints in a public sector bid, either a page count constraint or a word count constraint. If there's a page count, normally it will have with it a font size that's specified. Usually it's Arial 11 or Arial 12, for example. So if you adhere to the page count and you use a font that's bigger than the one that's provided, it's non-compliant, but it's probably going to be accepted because it doesn't give you an unfair advantage. If you adhere to a page count but used Arial font size 8, you can clearly add more words in that somebody who applied the font size constraint can, and therefore you might just be disqualified for that. So all of that work that you've done by not applying the font size could count you out of a bid. So it is super important to manage those constraints. If you've got a word count and a page count at play, also remember if you go over them, it will simply be ignored. So if it's a 2-page page count and you put 3 in, the 3rd page will never get to the evaluator, they won't read it, it will be redacted in governance checks beforehand. If it's a 500-word count and you put 600 words in, the last 100 words would be redacted out. The evaluator won't see it. And therefore, it could mean that you get a lesser score just by not observing those word counts. Also check if the additional documents, if you're allowed to put them in, whether they count into the word count or page count or not. Sometimes they can, and I've had that myself just recently where I've had to convert PDFs that I would normally upload as evidence to a bid into Word to check the word count and then make sure that it wasn't there wasn't too many words. So I couldn't upload my complaints process because it was more than the entire word count that was allowed on a question that was asking about a complaints process. So just make sure that all of those things add up and you're not falling foul of those constraints. But here is a live example, and I've run workshops just on these questions before. So it's not a Bradford Council bid, but it was a live bid. It is for an approved provider list for adult social care. And there are more questions in this, but we've pulled out 3. The text highlighted in yellow are the verb elements that I talk about, the doing elements of it. And what we advise is that you physically tick off those elements of the question as you address them in your answer. And tick off when you've related your answer back to that part of the specification. So for example, in this, there are 6 doing elements of that first question. So how do you ensure care plans are individually tailored and person-centered and meets the needs and outcomes of the person? That's 3. Within your answer, please state how you ensure care plans are kept up to date. That's 4. What measures you have in place to ensure people are involved in their care planning. That's 5. And how you link with partners to ensure needs are met. That's 6. So there's 6 core elements of that first question. And you have 600 words to be able to answer those 6 core elements, and it has a weighting of 25%. So you can see at a glance, it's the most important question for the authority. And so it's where you want to score your best because that's got the maximum score allowed here. There's no attachments allowed in this one. So all you've got is 600 words. In the second one, you can see there are 3 seeking feedback, how the service might be approved and how you evidence that. 200 words, no attachments. And then that bottom one is interesting because there's 100 words, but you can see that it's for information only. There's 2 doing elements, but of the 3, obviously, you're not going to get a score on question 3 because it's for information only. So whilst you want to answer it and you want to answer it well, that isn't where you're going to focus your efforts. If you go on question 1, back to the specification and look at care plans, it will tell you in the specification about how that particular authority wants care plans to be put together, what it means to them for it to be individually tailored and person-centered, what the outcomes of the person are that they're looking for, and what they mean about being up to date and including other people into that planning process. So all the information that you need to reflect on that question will be in the specification, and then you'll be applying what you physically do or will do as an organisation and how you can evidence that. And if you pull those things together, you'll have the best chance at scoring as well as you can in any procurement opportunity. One thing to remember, whatever you write down in any bid, if you're successful, you'll be contractually obliged to deliver it. It becomes contractually binding. So it means that you are legally on the hook to deliver what you said. So If you say that you deliver individually tailored care plans that are person-centred, and you link that back to the specification in the way that the spec says they want it, then that's what you have to do. So if you're evidencing something as something you already do or something you will do in the future, at the point that you win the bid, that's what the contracting authority will expect you to work like. And so remember, when you're writing it down, it needs to be accurate, and it needs to be what you will be delivering going forward. And there are lots of common pitfalls in bids that we all get stuck with, and we all find in there. I've talked through a few of them already, but we asked 10 public sector organisations to tell us what they thought the common pitfalls were for organisations who were seeking to take part in opportunities. And that's across Yorkshire, but also beyond. And that talk about not answering the question came up time and time again. So reading the question in conjunction with a specification and then not relating the specification back to the answer will never get you the most scores that you can get, regardless of how great your answer might be. If it's not relative to the specification, then it's effectively not what they want to buy. So it might be brilliant, but not what they want to buy. So answer the question, answer it in conjunction with the specification, and be specific with your evidences. So almost, here is what I'm going to do, and here is how I'm going to do it, and here's some evidence of that if you've done it before. And if you don't do that, it will often result in lower scores. I'm not submitting all the documentation, and I have definitely fallen foul of this myself in bids where an insurance certificate hasn't gone up that they've asked for, or it might be that they've asked for a risk register and you've confirmed that you've got one, but you haven't uploaded it, for example. Now, usually contracting authority, if it's something like an insurance certificate, they will come and ask you for it, and you wouldn't be disqualified. But if they ask for an implementation plan, which will be scored, and you don't upload your implementation plan, you just answer the narrative part of the question, then you probably wouldn't get asked for that, and it could in fact count you out. And that's happened to me, and there is nothing more soul destroying than not uploading a document that you worked really hard on and not realising until after the deadline is closed, and missing out on an opportunity. So it feels really self-explanatory and very obvious, but check, double check, triple check. And you might be asked for evidence of insurances. It's worth noting in the new regulations, often things like insurances and accreditations, providers tell us, can be a barrier to taking part in public sector opportunities. The new regulations mean that you don't have to have those things for contract tender date. You only have to have them in place for contract start. So what we're seeing in bids already is that if you don't have £10 million public liability, but that's what the authority wants, they're not asking for you to have it now, but they are asking for a self-cleaning declaration to say, we will have this in place. If we're successful, we'll make sure it's in place for contract start date. So look out for those. So if something's asking you for an insurance or an accreditation, Cyber Essentials is a good example. It's not the easiest accreditation to go and get. You shouldn't have to have it for when you bid. You should only have to have it for when you're doing the work. And that is precisely to help smaller organisations not have to spend money before they know they've got awarded the business. Caveating is just a big no-no in public sector. Bids that are received with caveats about what a bidder will or won't do around the pricing is often really difficult for evaluators, and it puts the contracting authority in a really awkward position. If you find that when you're trying to price something that it is dependent on some more information, you need to ask that in clarification questions early. Caveats in bids they're just not great, and they can often hurt your bid entry as opposed to helping it. Unless it's really specific in terms of scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3, where the contracting authority is almost asking you to give those different scenario options. The specification match, again, it's one of those core documents, and very early on you will have hopefully ticked off in the specification that you can deliver the spec in the manner that it's intended through the contracting authority. Again, it's worth noting that you might have a better way of doing things than the specification is calling for. However, in public procurement law, the contracting authority has got to buy what's laid out in the specification. Either that, or they have to abandon that procurement and write a new specification and then go and buy it. So if somebody is asking for a particular way of working in delivering care plans, for example, and you've developed some brilliant technology that does it in a completely different way, it's more effective, more efficient, it's more cost effective. If that's not what's being asked in the questions, you wouldn't necessarily be able to bid that. And you wouldn't be able to go back to the authority and say, look, I've got a better way of doing this. Have you thought about it? Because in that procurement, they can only buy what's written in the spec. What we try and encourage the public sector to do is pre-market engagement, where the contracting authority gets the market together to say, this is what we're thinking about buying. What does this feel like? Provide a marketplace. And so harnesses all of the knowledge and talent in that marketplace. That's what we hope. And try and encourage the public sector to do. In terms of reusing previous bids, I am definitely a fan of having templates so that the bid process can be as dynamic as possible for you, because we're busy business owners. When we're bidding something, it takes us away from our day jobs. However, there are some health warnings with that. Make sure that you're assessing the relevance to this particular bid. Make sure that you remove any references to other clients or other bids that are not relevant or relative to the one that you're currently bidding. So reuse anything that you can, but just check and double check that it's right and proportionate. A lack of evidence will always be an issue. If you can't support the statements that you're making, then you will probably score lower than somebody who can support the statements that you're making. So always get to the so what point when you're writing your bid. If you say something, think about the so what of that. And again, we've talked about key information missing. If things, if information has been asked for, make sure you upload it, but also don't put superfluous information in there. If they haven't asked for it, try not to include it, and especially if that counts into your word count or page count, because you'll just waste the allocation and lead you away from key information. We've talked about word count and page count, so I won't cover that again. Assumptions is one that I don't know if people really know about. An evaluator might have worked with you before, but they might not have. But regardless, any evaluator has to park their knowledge at the door when they're evaluating a bid. So any prior knowledge cannot be taken into account. Every single bid can only be judged on what's written down in that bid submission. So you might expect a provider, if you're the incumbent provider, the customer to know you, to know that you do things really well, and therefore not write it all down. That could lose you a bid. You can only be judged on what you write down in your bid submission. So don't assume that an evaluator can use any prior knowledge, because they can't in law. And actually, an evaluator might not be a technical expert in this area. And the theory is, and it works in practice, I do lots of evaluations for lots of companies. An evaluator should be able to read the specification, read the evaluation criteria, read the instructions to bidders, and be able to evaluate any bid, because it is an anonymous process where you are judged against what you've written down versus the specification and the evaluation criteria, not judged against other bidders. So don't make assumptions in the bid process. And the final thing that these buyers brought up was selection questionnaire compliance, failing to meet those minimum basic requirements, the accreditations, the policies, procedures, insurances, etc., or not able to commit to having those in place for when the work starts if you were successful. The standard selection questionnaire can be massive. So if you do want some help with that, I've mentioned it before, the Public Sector Supply Ready programme is there to help you. And just finally, I'm not going to dwell on this, help is on hand. Go for Growth offers support free of charge to any provider of any size in any sector. We're commissioned by Bradford Council, so all of these links are live. You can come and chat to us. You can have a coffee and a slice of cake. You have to provide your own coffee and cake, though, if it's virtual. If it's in person, we'll definitely sort that out. There's lots of video tutorials for you in there as well. And if you wanted to stay in touch, you can sign up to our mailing list. We hate spam, so we don't spam. You can opt out at any time. The things that we would talk to you about is opportunities in the public sector, changes to the regulations, other events and training things that we're running about, things that we think are useful to providers when they're trying to work in the public sector, but nothing else. You won't hear about my cat or my dog or what happened on my holiday. We promise, we absolutely promise. And that is a whistle-stop tour of the tender ready process. And we've got a good few minutes left, so there are no questions currently in the chat or in the Q&A, but the floor is yours. Tyra, if you have any questions or any comments you want to make, I'll take any questions. And what I will do is I'll unmute everybody just so that if people do want to have a chat, they absolutely can. So you can all unmute yourselves now, you should be able to. And I can see, I don't know your name, sorry, because everybody is here as Tyra today. I can see there is one hand up. If you'd like to shout out your question, feel free. Can you come off mute? Is everybody able to come off mute?
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, hi, Gillian.
Hi.
Hi, I can hear a couple. So I've got a lady on my screen who put a hand up first, I think, and then the gentleman with the glasses on his head.
Okay, thank you. So it's Akila Chowdhury from Love in Care. My question is that for this particular process, is there a financial threshold of turnover for the providers? And perhaps sort of looking at kind of a wider aspect of the question, is there always a threshold requirement for the providers to be at a certain financial size?
So I can answer one part of that question. Tyra might know for the particular opportunity for Bradford Council, there isn't always a financial threshold, no. It will be bid related. So it will be very clear in the documents if a financial threshold is at play, but there isn't always one. But Tyra, do you know if there is one for this opportunity?
I'm just going to say, based on the value of the contract, there most likely will be, but any information will go out in all the tender documents once we launch that.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to just come off mute? I can see you're chatting, but I can't just hear you at this time. I've got 3 hands up. Yeah, go for it.
Forgot the question. We are currently in the process of tendering. We've got about 6 weeks left, don't we? But we're going through the process. Forgot the question, but it's great what you brought up.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, if you remember at a later date, feel free to drop me or Lauren an email, or Tyra, get in touch with any of us and we'll answer it for you. That's not a problem.
Thank you. Bye.
I can see another couple of hands up, but I don't know anybody's name. So I guess just shout out your question, and if you both shout out at the same time, we'll figure it out.
I was just going to ask about social value in Bradford. Is Bradford using the social value portal, or are they using their own questions as part of like the process, as like a narrative question rather than what the social value portal uses?
Yes. So Tyra, I think I know the answer to that, but if you absolutely know the answer to that, I'll let you answer it. It's up to you. Do you want me to go for it?
You go ahead, Gillian. That's fine. Thanks.
So last I understood, and the head of procurement has subsequently left Bradford, but last I understood they weren't using the social value portal. They had exited social value portal. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they won't be using the TOMs. So the TOMs are themes, outputs and measures, and they have a specific set of questions that would be asked in a bid if you're using either social value portal or the TOMs separately from social value portal. So they weren't using SVP, but I'm not sure if they're still using the TOMs is the question. We are doing an event actually that's linked to the TOMs. We're doing it in person in Barnsley in October. It will be advertised on our Eventbrite, and if you're on our mailing list, we'll be sending information out about it. You don't have to be a Barnsley provider to come along if Barnsley is easily commutable for you. We will also record that session about the themes, outputs and measures, the TOMs for social value. It will be a little bit tailored to Barnsley Council, but it will be transferable to anybody using the TOMs. So if you can't make it, have a look out for that on our Bid Skills YouTube channel as well. So we know it's a big, complicated area, is social value for lots of providers. So I know we've got one more hand up. Does anybody want to jump in?
Hi, Gillian. Can you hear me?
Yes, I've got you.
Hi, it's Rex.
Hi.
My question is, because usually sometimes they ask you for a method statement and then there's a response document that sort of asks you the same question. So if you've detailed, you've given a detailed answer in the method statement, is it advisable just to copy and paste across to the document, or should you tailor your answer specifically to that document?
Yeah, so it's a really pertinent question, because I had exactly this myself in a bid recently. So if you've got two questions, one is talking about the same thing, and then you're asked for a method statement to back up that answer. Effectively, what they're looking for is the what and then the how. So what will you do? And then the method statement is how you will do it. So there is a subtle difference between the two questions where you've got a method statement. That method statement is really a description of how you'll do what you've said you'll do.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
No
Thanks for the presentation. That was very good.
No worries. So we have a couple of questions on the screen. So absolutely, we as an organisation, Go for Growth, we're too little to, because we support 8,500 providers at the minute. We can't do tender review or bid writing for anyone. But what we will do, if there's specific questions that you want us to work through, we'll go through and as a practitioner look at those verb elements and just give you our view of it. Absolutely. So come and ask us whatever questions you've got, and if we can do it, we'll do it, and if we can't, we'll probably know someone who can. So we're here to help. Yeah, just give us a shout if you've got any questions or queries at all. If there is no more questions, just from me and from Tyra, thank you ever so much for coming along. It's been lovely to see you all. It's been great to meet you. Do give us a shout if there's anything else that we can do to help. That's what we're here for, and we'll get the documents out to you in the next 24 hours.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Tyra.
Thank you ever so much.